Master. Now let's turn our attention to General Motors' record $35 million fine for failing to disclose an ignition switch defect that were linked to 13 fatalities. But the fine is not the end of the government's investigation into safety issues at the nation's biggest automaker. Chief Washington correspondent Peter Cook has more on today's agreement. Peter, tell us what's going on.
Well, what's going on is even before GM has wrapped up its own internal investigation into what's happened here, federal regulators, Pimm, have reached their own conclusion that the company effectively broke the law by not telling regulators years ago about ignition problems in the Chevy Cobalt and other GM vehicles, problems that have now, as you said, been linked to 13 deaths. As a consequence of all that, the company today entering into an agreement with the Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, I should say, that will force GM to pay a record $35 million fine and be subject to unprecedented safety oversight going forward.
Together, these penalties should put all automakers on notice that there is no excuse and zero tolerance for failing to notify the federal government when a defect puts safety at risk.
In addition to the fine, again, the maximum civil penalty allowed by law, the company admits that it did not disclose details about the defect in a timely fashion and agreed to internal changes in how it handles safety reviews going forward, as well as ongoing oversight from federal regulators that's generally considered unprecedented. In a statement acknowledging the agreement, GM CEO Mary Barra says, quote, "We have learned a great deal from this recall. We will now focus on the goal of becoming an industry leader in safety. We will emerge from this situation a stronger company." GM shares ended the day down. They actually rose immediately after the news, perhaps relief that the penalty wasn't bigger, and that fine is less than a day's revenue at GM based on its first quarter earnings, but it is the maximum allowed by law. And Pimm, GM's problems in Washington far from over. The Justice Department is still looking into this, as is Congress as well.
All right, Peter, just stay with me because I want to bring in some other guests to give us a little bit more perspective on this fine. And let's turn now our attention to Karl Brauer. He joins us from California of Kelley Blue Book. Also, Tim Higgins, our reporter from Detroit who covers GM. Tim Higgins, let's start off with you. What does this fine, $35 million, does it really mean anything for GM's bottom line, or is this just really just a sort of window dressing?
Well, this is a company that makes billions of dollars in net profit on an annual basis, so it's really just a rounding error almost. Really, the issue is the greater government oversight. Even before this, CEO Mary Barra was talking about implementing changes to the company to try to prevent these future things. She's reorganized the engineering department. She's implemented a new program to try to encourage employees to raise their hand if they see safety concerns. She's appointed additional safety inspectors in the company to root out these kind of issues.
Karl Brauer, come in on the topic of the consumer. Has this recall and does this government fine affect consumer perception of GM automobiles?
You know, we haven't seen it impact them yet at Kelley Blue Book in terms of consideration and traffic on General Motors vehicle pages. You do wonder at what point there's a threshold that might be crossed and people start to really wonder about the product. And it's ironic when you consider the fact that this is all a symbol. I mean, this fine is a symbol of them being told they've got to be better. A lot of the work they're doing and some more recent recalls they've put out there is a sign of them putting more due diligence on finding recalls and solving them. But you hope the average consumer doesn't just keep hearing recall, recall, GM recall and wonder if there's something wrong with all the cars.
Peter Cook, is there any likelihood that GM's Mary Barra will be recalled to Washington to testify?
I would not be surprised if that doesn't happen in the future. But Pimm, this is probably for the moment the big news for GM here in Washington. The Justice Department investigation, wherever that may stand at this point, that's the big shoe to drop that everyone's waiting for. But we have no sense right now of any timing or whether, again, the Justice Department will find any criminal wrongdoing here. You'll recall back in March, they imposed a $1.2 billion fine or penalty on Toyota for its safety issues there, part of a deferred prosecution agreement. That's the number that really might affect investors in GM more, might be more worrisome to management for sure. That's the investigation I think that's on everyone's radar.
Tim Higgins, what about the internal investigation at GM? Are there going to be heads rolling?
Yeah, we're expecting that report in the next week or two from GM's lawyers and external lawyers who've been hired to dig in deep to figure out who, what, where, and why all of this occurred. People I talked to say that names will be announced, and some of the details will definitely be released. And in today's agreement with NHTSA, GM even agreed to release that report to regulators, and so that's a sign that information is going to come out on what occurred.
Karl Brauer, tell us about the actual models that have been affected by this recall. They're not even sold anymore, are they?
No, these models represent, GM's past. A lot of what they did represents GM before the bankruptcy and restructuring. And I think that's the message that Mary Barr has been trying to send. And it's actually a genuine and an honest message. And I think, we haven't even seen those vehicles necessarily take a sales or valuation hit at Kelley Blue Book. And I really feel like the company's looking forward and effectively trying to solve these problems from the past as quickly as possible. I do believe Mary's genuinely, sending that message because it's true.
Tim Higgins, has this affected GM's stock price?
Yeah, they're down about 16% so far this year, 17% so far this year. You talk to some analysts and they would say some of that is probably regarding some of the issues they have in Asia, in Europe, and South America, where they're running into some headwinds. So this is definitely contributing to the decline, but they also face a lot of challenges just around the world and running a global automaker.
I want to thank you very much, gentlemen. Tim Higgins joining us from Detroit, covering GM for Bloomberg News. My thanks also to Karl Brauer joining us from San Francisco from Kelley Blue Book, and of course Peter Cook, our chief Washington correspondent, joining us from Washington, D.C. Coming up next on